Well, hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Katie can take down the polls and we can find out what you had to say. So we'll get started with our program. My name is Deborah Martin Downs. I am the current president of the Muskoka Lakes Association. I am a second-generation cottager on Lake Muskoka, and I'm also a member of the Environment Committee, and I had flooding in the last few years as well. So we'll just look at the results of the polls. We've got a lot of MLA members on the line, so that's terrific. We have people who heard about it mostly from our emails, but still some word of mouth. We have a lot of people from the township of Muskoka Lakes, where obviously a lot of the water level issues have been occurring, and certainly a lot from Lake Muskoka because of the issues that most of Muskokans faced. And a lot of people on the line who experienced flooding in one of the 3 years that flooding occurred. And some had a lot of damage, but most had some damage. So something that people are looking for some answers on. And I'm glad to see some of you receive our Flood Watch communication that Chris Craig, our director of the and chair of our Environment Committee, produces for you at this time of year. So glad that you receive it, and we'd be happy to get it in the hands of others. So we'll close that up for now. So let's talk a little bit first about the topic tonight: why Muskoka Lake water levels, past, present, and future. Well, if you've been around as long as I have, you say you've never seen flooding like this, like that we've had over the past decade. We have to agree with you. There's been 3 flood events in 8 years. It's unprecedented. Is it the embodiment of climate change? Is there someone to blame for our twisted and missing docks, or our submerged boathouses, for our lost dock chairs, or our flower pots? And by the way, if anybody's still got a flower pot missing, I have a couple of them on my shoreline. Tonight, you're going to learn how water moves through the Muskoka River watershed, what a floodplain is, what drives the lake levels, and how they're managed, and what can be done to manage better in the future. There are some really exciting opportunities on the horizon. You will learn that flooding is a natural phenomenon, but our actions in the watershed have changed how water moves through the system and the impacts it has. The moment we began building more substantive structures on our shorelines, floodings mattered more to us. So let's get going. Here's what's going to happen tonight. Each of our panelists is going to present, and we are giving them a short period of time, except for our first panelist, who's going to set the stage for us. And then we'll have time for questions of the panel. We'll be taking questions from the floor, as we know the Q&A box to be contributed by you sitting behind us. We have a few housekeeping rules for you tonight. First, all of our participants are muted, so you're not going to be able to speak tonight or show us your COVID haircuts on video. You'll find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to ask any of our panelists a question this evening, just type it into the box and press enter to have it posted. And if you'd like to direct it to a particular panelist, just add their name in there as well. You will be able to vote up a question. So if you like one that someone else has already put in the Q&A, if you just like it, and that'll make it more likely to be answered, and it reduces the repetition. So it'll move it up the ranks in the questions. I would like to remind you all that this is a respectful conversation tonight, and I ask that all questions be framed that way. Our speakers are our guests tonight, and they're here to help us understand. And if we can't get to all the questions, we're going to endeavor to get answers for you, and we'll be posting them with the webinar. Of course, a reminder to our panelists that you need to use your mute button when you're not speaking. And as well, we will be recording the webinar so that members or others who are not able to attend will be able to look at it at their leisure from our website. So we're going to get started. Our first speaker was to have been Chris Craig. He's on our banner, but he took ill today. So Chris Neer, the Resource Management Supervisor, Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry of Parry Sound District, has graciously agreed to do double duty and incorporated some of Chris's material into his presentation. Chris grew up in Huntsville and currently resides on a rural property in Utterson with his wife, dog, and 9-week-old daughter, Frankie. We're surprised you're actually standing up, Chris. That's terrific. His post-secondary studies focused on business, forestry, and resource management, and he has a master's of environmental studies as well. He's been with the Ontario Public Service for more than 20 years, most of which have been spent in Muskoka and Parry Sound. And when he's not at work, his happy place is in a canoe, like so many of us on this call. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can put your presentation up.
Thanks very much, Deborah. I'm just hoping I'm projecting now. If it's
you are,
for
that's
everyone.
Good. You got
Excellent. It. Great. So thank you for the introduction, and more importantly, thank you to the Muskoka Lakes Association for the invitation to participate today with other panel members. The purpose of my presentation is to provide a brief overview of current dam operations, water management planning, and speak a bit about flooding. I'm just going to jump right into my presentation now, as I'm also interested in giving the other panel members lots of time to present as well. Muskoka River watershed originates on the western slopes of Algonquin Park, highlighted in the green on the slide, and descends 300 meters over a distance of 210 kilometers before flowing into Georgian Bay via the Musquash and Moon Rivers. It's 5,100 square kilometers in size, approximately the size of PEI. It includes more than 2,000 lakes, and in terms of annual precipitation, it's also one of the wettest locations in Ontario. Water is found in more than just the lakes in the watershed and the snow on the ground. The water cycle is constant, meaning that water may be evaporating, transpiring from trees, trapped in the atmosphere temporarily, falling in the form of precipitation, held in surface depressions and wetlands, or stored in the ground. There are actually 15 smaller subwatersheds within the Muskoka River watershed. Geology shows us that most of the watershed is Precambrian bedrock with a thin soil covering shown in pink here. On the
Chris, you're still on your first slide. Can you advance it? Or is it not advancing?
I have been advancing. I'm sorry.
Uh-oh. Always a glitch. There, that's better. Okay, we got it now. Yep.
So I'm sorry about that, folks.
Maybe you could go back to the water balance one there for a minute.
Yeah.
Would need that.
So here's the overview of the watershed starting in Algonquin Park, flowing from east to west towards Georgian Bay. Just an example of the hydrology and water moving through the system. And I was just speaking about subwatersheds and geology. So there are actually 15 smaller subwatersheds within the Muskoka River watershed. Geology shows that most of the watershed is Precambrian bedrock with a thin soil covering it. There is a major band of glacial deposited sand across the center where Highway 11 and much of the rivers flow. I wanted to bring this to your attention to help illustrate the idea that each of the subwatersheds is unique and will actually react differently based on its characteristics. In addition to the unique geology across the landscape, factors like frozen or saturated soil or areas that have been filled in or hardened for development all play a role in how water moves through the watershed. This slide provides another visual representation of how water moves through the watershed. From east to west, water moves down the north branch, including the Huntsville Lake systems, the south branch, Lake of Bays and Quagama, through the main branch, including Lake Muskoka, out to Georgian Bay, and through the Moon and Musquash rivers. Many of the dams in Muskoka were located and constructed in the late 1800s for specific purposes such as floating timber, commercial navigation of steamships, and hydroelectric generation. Dams range from large structures to small structures, and while most have been rebuilt over time, most also have kept their original design characteristics. After extensive consultation and analysis, the Muskoka River Water Management Plan was finalized in 2006. Operational strategies within the plan are based in part on the original Hackner-Holden Agreement from 1940, which had focused on lake regulation for water power production. Today, the plan attempts to balance social, economic, and environmental objectives, and does so by prescribing desirable lake levels on lakes where dams are located. Today, there are 42 water control structures in the watershed, 29 of which are operated by the ministry. The watershed is a cascading system, and the lakes throughout the system are all different sizes with different storage capacities. It may be useful to think of the lakes in the watershed as a series of bathtubs. Each of the bathtubs is a different size, has a different size faucet to fill it, and different size drainage hole, and those drainage holes may even be at unique heights or elevations. With the cascading bathtub analogy in mind, it's easy to understand that many changes in the system will have direct impacts both upstream and downstream. So all changes have to be considered and coordinated carefully. So how are lakes managed today? Included within the plan are what we refer to as rule curves, which identify the target lake levels and normal operating range for lake levels. The example on this slide is for Lake Muskoka and shows the lake levels plotted by elevation. The blue line represents the actual lake level on Lake Muskoka through 2020. The green line is the target line, and the area between the upper and yellow lines is referred to as the normal operating zone. The red line on the top is the flooding elevation, and the lower red line is considered the low water elevation. Lake level target varies based on the time of year. As an example, in the summer, the target elevation for lakes will decline throughout the summer, as is the case here in Muskoka, for Lake Muskoka. This decline recognizes lake levels will fall naturally due to flows being passed downstream and evaporation. The operating plan for each managed lake is also unique in that it reflects a variety of management objectives for that lake specifically. As an example, you'll see a declining target level in the fall on Lake Muskoka. This is to encourage species like lake trout to spawn deeper so that the eggs they lay do not become exposed during the winter drawdown. So in general, the dam operations attempt to operate the dams to target levels at different times of year. In this slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about storage capacity. I've listed the largest lakes within the watershed, including lakes in the North Branch, in Huntsville, Quagga, and Lake of Bays on the South Branch, and lakes further downstream. If we look at the size of the lakes, we can get a sense of where storage capacity is located. We are regularly asked why we don't draw lakes down further, and there are a couple of responses to that question. Firstly, I would say our decisions are informed by a water management plan that has been based on a hydraulic analysis and also attempts to balance a variety of values. Some of the concerns that exist regarding drawing lakes down further include negative impacts to waterfront property owners on that lake in the winter, impacts to environmental values on the lake, including impacts to fish, amphibians, and invertebrates. And in drier springs, we may be challenged to actually fill the lake, and lake levels may remain low throughout the summer. In addition to those concerns are the practical realities. The elevation at the outlet of Lake Muskoka makes it challenging to draw the lake down further, particularly when lake levels are lower, such as in the spring. Maybe most importantly though, the results of the modeling that we've done have shown that there is no significant reduction in peak flooding events by drawing the lake down further. The high inflows fill the extra storage, may delay the flooding by hours or maybe a day, but the storage capacity in the lakes is simply not sufficient to prevent flooding like the examples we saw in 2013 or 2019. I'd like to now shift to how we manage water. On a daily basis, ministry staff review and document watershed conditions and plan operations at water control structures in the district. We refer to this as the daily planning cycle. Water levels and flows are managed by manually removing logs or replacing logs into the dam. Individual dam operations are informed by a number of factors, including current watershed conditions, weather forecasts, and plan objectives. One dam operation usually results in a series of operations in the cascading watershed. Ministry staff are on the landscape every day, operating dams, maintaining dams, and communicating with other dam operators in the system. In addition to monitoring and reacting to short and long-term weather forecasts, to help inform decisions at this time of year, ministry staff also regularly collect snow information, which tells us essentially how much water is on the landscape and whether or not the ground is frozen. This map shows the municipal boundaries within the watershed. The locations of the snow stations are identified in red, and they're located within the sub-watersheds, and the Environment Canada weather stations are also on this illustration. It's important to note that there are triggers built into the water management plan to respond to conditions in the watershed. As an example, if we have more snow than average in the spring, then operators will target a lower drawdown. It's also important to note that drawing the lakes down further may provide for some additional storage capacity when the snow melts, but as noted earlier, will not prevent flooding in all cases. In addition to the dams and the water control structures, flows and levels are influenced by natural and human-made constrictions, which directly influence water levels. This image identifies some of the known constrictions in the watershed. At these locations, when the flow and elevation exceed a certain value, the constriction will act as a dam and water elevations will rise upstream. As an example, if the flows downstream at the outlet of Bala exceed 85 cubic meters a second, the constriction at the Moon Chutes will back up water. Other factors which have a direct influence on how the watershed reacts to inputs include the availability of wetlands for storage capacity, whether or not the ground is frozen, saturated, is naturally bedrock, or whether or not an area has potentially been hardened, an example being paving. I understand the devastating impacts of flooding on our communities and the lives of the people of Muskoka. We've seen severe flooding in Muskoka in the last decade, and flooding has occurred in Muskoka historically as well. Flooding can occur in the watershed at any time of year. As an example, a severe thunderstorm in the summer may lead to flooding, or warm temperatures combined with rain or a snow event in January could also lead to flooding. One of the realities in the watershed is that ministry dams are not flood control structures, and they have very limited capacity to store or hold back flood waters. Spring flooding in the Muskoka watershed is usually a combination of rapid snowmelt, significant rain, and warmer temperatures. As a result of the significant flooding in Muskoka and the rest of the province in 2019, the provincial government commissioned a report by the Special Advisor on Flooding, Douglas McNeil. His report, entitled An Independent Review of the 2019 Flood Events in Ontario, was released in the fall of that year. His analysis, specific to Muskoka, confirmed that dams have a limited capacity to draw down lakes to prevent flooding. Further to that, he also suggested the water management plans cannot prevent flooding in Muskoka. Flooding is a natural event that occurred in Muskoka before the water management plan was implemented, and unfortunately will continue to occur. Even though we know water management plans can't prevent flooding, there is still lots that can be done. In March of 2020, Ontario released the Protecting People and Property Ontario's Flooding Strategy. This strategy is designed to help us do just that by introducing a series of new and enhanced actions that will reduce flood risks and make our province better prepared for flooding events, better equipped to respond to them, and more capable of recovering from them quickly. One of the actions within the provincial strategy that is specific to this watershed was to engage with municipalities and watershed partners in Muskoka. As a result, the ministry has started facilitating a communications committee, which to date has now met on 4 occasions. We know we can't prevent flooding, only become more prepared for it and resilient to it. In order to improve our situation and become more prepared, we all have a role to play, and this panel is a good example of that collaboration. I'm excited to hear from some of the other panelists today on areas that they've been working on. You can find out more information on flooding at some of the websites listed here or by doing a search. The information available on these sites include how to prepare or respond to flooding. It includes the Special Advisor's Report, the Provincial Flood Strategy, and the Muskoka River Water Management Plan. I know we're also going to hear from Kevin Boyle this afternoon on an exciting initiative from the District of Muskoka. That concludes my presentation today. I would once again want to thank the Muskoka Lakes Association for inviting me to present today and sit on the panel. And I'm excited to continue and participate in the discussion afterwards. Thanks, Deborah.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was great. Sorry we got off to a little rough start, but that's the way these things go. But that's terrific. So
my apologies. I'll try to stop sharing.
No worry. Yeah. So you can stop sharing and don't leave town, because I know there's a lot of questions that are coming up for you. So Our next speaker is Kevin Boyle, and Kevin is the Climate Change Initiatives Coordinator with the District of Muskoka. Kevin, you can start your screen too. Prior to joining the district, Kevin spent years working as an environmental consultant, specializing in human health and ecological risk assessment. He completed his honors BA in geography and environmental studies at McMaster University and has a postgraduate diploma in environmental management and assessment from Niagara College. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us tonight, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
All right, let me just make sure you can see my screen there, Deborah.
We can.
Excellent. And I'll just ask again in a second if it advances, but I wanted to take an opportunity to thank everyone and thank the MLA for the opportunity to provide some information on the district's floodplain mapping project. Let's see here. Did that advance properly, Deborah?
It did. You're good.
Excellent. All right, we're off to the races. Well, I thought we'd start very basic. I know probably a lot of people on this call understand flooding, especially in this area, quite well. But to start with, let's just go with what is a floodplain. So a floodplain, of course, is a low-lying area that adjoins a watercourse that is not ordinarily covered by water. Really quickly, as you see on the screen, where your stream bed, lake, or river is, usually wetlands off to the side, and then historical development areas that went in prior to any floodplain mapping being completed. And then, of course, we see new development there. And so what is floodplain mapping? Floodplain mapping is essentially determining this area that gets inundated by floods, where historic development used to occur. And in Muskoka, we have sort of two sets of floodplain maps available. We have them in PDF form through our website, as well as through GeoHub, which I'm going to take you a tour on very shortly. But those floodplain maps are split into two different types of mapping. One is a one zone policy area, and that's for all of our lakes where you have a static water level, and so that would be your floodway. And then, of course, the other is in our river areas where you actually have flowing or moving water, where we actually have a two zone concept. And the purpose of that is that it accounts for the fact that people can drown once water levels become deep enough, even at low velocities, and they can also be swept off their feet if the velocity is too high, even at relatively small depths. So according to MRR guidance, when you have that moving water, you do the two zone flooding. Also, for our floodplain maps, we did capture about 250 square kilometers of floodplain maps. And of course, we know that there was significant flooding in Muskoka in 2008, 2013, 2016, 2019. And of course, the 2019 flood was on record the worst flood that we have recorded history of, with 3 of the 4 Water Survey of Canada stations maxing it out. We also know that during that year alone, we had just completed our floodplain mapping project. And the district was aware of 90 roads that flooded during 2019, and about 50 of those roads were actually captured within the boundaries of our floodplain mapping project. This information is crucial to help inform emergency plans for our emergency control group for the district and area municipalities to respond. It also helps with evacuation routes, and certainly it can determine direction of planning policy with respect to new development. Of course, we know prior to the 1980s, there wasn't much floodplain mapping done. And in the late 80s, there was a flood damage reduction, some floodplain mapping done by the federal government in partnership with the province. So what we have now is fairly comprehensive floodplain maps for certain areas of Muskoka. What you're looking at is an example of one of our PDF maps. And so we have maps available in 2 different ways. One is online through our GeoHub, which I'll go to next. And the other one is PDF maps for individual sections of all the lakes and rivers that are easy to print and also contain some additional information like elevations at these cross sections you see here. In this 2-zone area, you can see the red floodway, and then you can see the orange cross hatching is the flood fringe, because this is an area of moving water. On the other side, we have Fairy Lake here, which shows the static water level, as shown in the cross hatching here. For example, just some of the data that we've been able to glean from our floodplain mapping project is we know that there are 8,584 buildings within the flood line. Now, we don't know if these are garages, sheds, boathouses, or actual residentials at this point, based on our assessment. And we don't know what elevation those buildings are at. But we do know that if we run a search, that's what we find. We also know that there's about 11,500 properties that fall within the floodlines, and that breaks down to about 6,600 seasonal residential properties, 2,200 permanent residential properties, and currently 2,150 vacant properties that have floodlines that impact them to some extent. Let's see. And now where we are now. And so we're really excited to share our floodplain mapping in our new GeoHub mapping service. So what I'm actually going to do, and hopefully we don't get a technical glitch here, is I'm going to stop sharing very briefly. And then I'm going to actually take us right to the Muskoka GeoHub. So maybe I'll just make sure that it works. Deb, can you see now the Muskoka GeoHub website?
I can. Good job.
Excellent, excellent. All right, well, now I want to show you a little bit of a tour of our tour called the Muskoka GeoHub. This is definitely the easiest way to access all of our floodplain maps, but I should note that it also has zoning for many of our municipalities. There's some really cool 3D building stuff. And I use it, the Trail Explorer, like for the Natural Resource Center. I actually can see myself walking through those trails. I think that's really great, but I digress. What you want to go to is our floodline and LiDAR mapping. That'll take you to a map that looks somewhat like this. So this would be the mouth of the Muskoka River at Bracebridge. And what you see here, if you just let it load, is where we have the static lines, or the purple, which is the static lake flood elevation area. And then over in the river area, you have the two zone, the floodway and the flood fringe. But some really cool options that we have here are, because we did LiDAR, which is basically a laser detection system that we fly a plane over to get really, really detailed topographic information. Not only can we click on a property and get some information about the property, how many acres it is, a lot of the general information, but if we click to the second page, we can actually see exactly where we clicked is at 264.6 meters. And because we have this LiDAR, now if we went lower on that property, we'd be able to see basically right on that spot to a very high accuracy level, that's 227 meters. So we can see that 260 to 227 meter difference. The other thing when you look at this map is LiDAR clears away all buildings, all structures, and all trees. So what it's actually showing you is the earth. So you can see the outline of a parking lot in the top of the screen here. So some of the things that can help you out as well is there's a little swipe bar tool here that you can click on. And what it does, if you go to our layers list up here, it'll allow you to select a layer, and then you could actually go back and forth to see your property or to see your shoreline, and you can compare that to different years, going back all the way to 69, which we think is really helpful. A brand new addition that we have are these little blue tabs. Now, if I go back to the actual legend here, are these blue tabs. And these blue tabs basically show us where we had flooded roads in the 2019 flood event. So you can see here, historically flooded roadways. And we thought that would be great for planning, but also so people could have the ability to see that ahead of the freshet. Now, the last thing that I wanted to show you that I think is probably most pertinent for this conversation that we're having today, and I do apologize for the flooding or for the loading here, is these actual live water level stations that we have. So now you have access, so this is for Lake Muskoka, to click on one of our water stations, and it'll actually give you the current water level. And what we've added here is the conversion factor. So these water stations, we get this information live every day from the MNR. And there's a conversion factor applied to the level we get to get the actual meters above sea level elevation. And so we have that right here. The other thing that we think is really useful is if you scroll down on this lake, we can see that the normal level for that current day is at 8.99, whereas the current level is 8.76. So about 20 centimeters lower than the current level day. Now, what is a normal level day? In order to find that out, we've added some links to where the data actually comes from. If we go here, we can see a normal level for current day. That is actually the mean water level for that day going through years of data in meters. We think that this is really useful. The other thing that you can see is if you wanted to see a historical trend of what it looked like at that water level, you're able to actually directly link to that page. And of course, you can go back in time. And so you can really get a snapshot and really see a lot of information from that one little new tab that we've added. We also, if you just bear with me here, I need to be able to see my, we also have added a new section to our webpage. So the district's web pages have all been revamped to be accessible and to follow accessibility guidelines. And we have a really great flooding and floodplain mapping page now. And on here, you have a link to get to the GeoHub so you can see those real-time water levels, as well as a little informational video that gives you some tips on using that, as well as some other tips and tricks from our Chief McWilliam on flooding. And then, of course, it takes you right through all the information, how to be prepared, what to do before a flood. You can get access to all the individual PDF maps here. You can access the GeoHub. And we even have a how-to video built in that shows you how to use the GeoHub. I will pause that though. Sorry. And so we tried to provide as much resources as possible so that you could be flood ready. So what to do before a flood, what to do after a flood, cleanup information. We wanted some links to our local area municipalities. And then of course, a frequent asked questions section on our flood mapping project. All right, bear with me as I get my presentation up again. There we go. All right, and let me just make sure that everyone can see that. Is the presentation?
You're back. Yep.
I'm back. Excellent. Okay. Sorry, it always throws me off going back and forth here. All right. And so lastly, that LiDAR is really actually valuable information. So we were able to provide the LiDAR, the district provided the LiDAR to the town of Gravenhurst, which saved them a significant amount of money to help with a stormwater management study. We've captured that so far LiDAR for about 13% of the entire watershed, but also we've had requests from the Ministry of Natural Resources, the Canadian Centre for Earth Observations, the Canadian Forces were provided with the maps. Also, we know that Public Safety Canada, who funded the district's floodplain mapping, or half of the district's floodplain mapping project that was completed, they're creating, and we're sort of excited about this, they're creating a national flood database that includes LiDAR and floodplain maps across Canada. So we think that that's you know, a really good direction to have a central location for all of that information. But I thought I would end with just a quick snap on how cool the LiDAR is, but also the power of water. So as I mentioned before, the LiDAR gives that really detailed topographic information. And what you're seeing here is a picture of the Big East River, just sort of north of Huntsville. And this is the LiDAR before it's been classified. So what you're seeing is all of the trees all over here, and you can see the river and the little roads. But what I wanted to show you is when we classify that, it takes it right down to the ground, and all of a sudden you can see 10,000 years of water power with all the oxbows that's carved throughout this floodplain here. And I think it's really, it shows not only the power of water, but it also shows, you know, how cool the technology is that we're working with now, and how useful it can be for many applications. And with that, I thank you, and I would encourage you all to visit the GeoHub to look at our floodplain mappings. And if you ever need a little bit of an extra lesson, make sure to visit the district's flooding website or our geomatics website, and you'll have access to the how-to video. There we go. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kevin. That's fascinating. I'm sure that there's a few folks who are going to be right on that website after this to start noodling around with all those great graphics. So that's terrific what you guys have been able to do. So our final speaker tonight is Kevin Trimble. And Kevin is representing the Muskoka Watershed Advisory Group tonight. He and his wife moved permanently to Muskoka 7 years ago after 3 generations of his family cottaged on Lake Simcoe, but he saw the error of his ways and said Muskoka's best. So here he is. He's a semi-retired ecologist and was chair of the Muskoka Watershed Council until last year. As I said, he's a member of the Muskoka Watershed Advisory Group. There's 8 members of that group, and they recently made recommendations to the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks with their report. And Chris Craig, who was to have joined us, is also a member of that committee. Over the course of Kevin's 33-year career, he was involved in public and private sector projects in almost every sector in Ontario, including public infrastructure, mining, energy, land development, natural heritage strategy, and ecological restoration. So a great guy to be involved with both the Watershed Advisory Group and the Watershed Council. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you. I can see your screen.
Awesome. Thanks, Deb, and thanks for the invite and the introduction. I am an MLA member, and I live on one of the smaller lakes near Port Carling. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the opportunities we have going forward for water management. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about the Muskoka Watershed Advisory Group. So I'll briefly describe what the advisory group is, and apologies in advance if I use the term MWAG for advisory group, but you'll know what that means. I'm going to talk a little bit about watershed management, and finally the specifics of the recommendations from the advisory group. So these are the words from the Minister of Environment. The purpose, or rather the Muskoka Watershed Conservation and Management Initiative, it came from the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks to, and I quote, better identify risks and issues facing the Muskoka region, allowing the community and province to work together to protect the environment and support economic growth of this important area. And then in the second bullet, to develop a broader comprehensive approach to watershed management. You might recognize a few characters in this shot. Myself and Chris Craig are towards the left end of that, and some of our local politicians, the Minister of Environment and members of the committee. The Muskoka Watershed Advisory Group was formed to advise the minister specifically on two things: the most important issues facing the Muskoka River watershed and the highest priority types of projects needed to address those issues. In terms of the timeline, the initiative was started in August of 2018, and in the summer of 2019, the advisory group was formed by the minister. And we did our work through that winter with extensive community outreach sessions, and submitted an interim report to Minister Urick in October, in spite of the fact that that report is intended to be just advice from the advisory group to the minister. MECP, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, did release it to the public, although without fanfare. And since that time, they have entered into discussion with potential funding recipients and project delivery partners to look at potential for disseminating some of the money. And in terms of the money, there is a $5 million commitment specifically for the Muskoka watershed, and an additional $5 million if matched by community funding in phase 2. So there's up to $15 million available for the initiative in the first couple of phases of it. I'll speak to the specific recommendations in a few minutes, but first I just wanted to explain that there are three key categories of recommendations in the advisory group's report to Minister Urick. The most important recommendations revolve around integrated watershed management, but the most pressing need driving watershed management is flood mitigation. And so there are recommendations specifically on that. And then there were also specific project recommendations to enhance watershed health. So with respect to integrated watershed management, what we're talking about, and I'm just going to focus on the flooding aspects, is moving away from trying to predict and manage water after it's already gotten into our main rivers and lakes, to using the entire watershed area to manage our water as a resource. The watershed being that area that drains all of the water received in a year down to an individual outlet. In the case of the Muskoka River, we know we have the Musquash and Moon outlets down at Georgian Bay. So that's a 5,100 square kilometer area. It's a pretty big area, and it includes not only the main river channels and lakes in the system, but also a huge land base, many smaller lakes and streams and wetlands, and perhaps most importantly, all of our upland forests and very small headwater tributaries that really function like a gigantic capillary network in the watershed. And you know, the watershed is a little over 80% covered by natural vegetation, primarily forests. And MECP's Dorset Research Group has said that as a result of transpiration, roughly half of our annual precipitation is sent back to the atmosphere by forest trees. So that's potentially a lot of water that we don't even fully account for in many of the things we do. And when you combine all of these features and functions, we've got the forests, wetlands, small tributaries, even our town sites and our waterfront properties, there's a lot of space that we've never looked at for opportunities to store water, that all of the water that we have to deal with. And we're probably going to be dealing with more as time goes on, because nature's throwing some climate change at us. We know that we've entered into a big period of changes with our weather patterns, and also increasing pressure to develop more land in the watershed, which is going to affect flows. And this graph is from the Muskoka Watershed Council's climate change study. And you can see the green line represents up to present monthly precipitation patterns, and the numbers on the bottom are the months of the year. And the red line is the predicted change, and it shows that we're very likely going to be seeing, if anything, more precipitation focused in the late winter, early spring period, and potentially less precipitation, a little bit less anyway, in the early to mid-summer period. So that's going to affect the pattern of flows that we have to manage with our water management systems. The scientific community has generally accepted that the watershed is the best geographic scale for many land use planning applications, and also for water management. I'll call it IWM from here on in, but integrated watershed management is a process that allows all stakeholders, communities and government to coordinate their decisions on land use and water management across the whole watershed rather than in individual municipalities. It acknowledges that every decision we make will affect the rest of the socioeconomic and ecological elements in the watershed. And it's a complicated process, but it's necessary if we want to maximize our flood proofing potential without compromising environmental quality or adding to water quality problems like blue-green algae that seem to be getting worse all the time. And as another example, if we drop our water levels too far or at the wrong time, we could end up with either summer water levels that are too low, or new big long-term water quality problems being exacerbated. So the integrated watershed management will gives us a bit of a framework so that we can actually look for solutions in the whole watershed. We can treat sources of the problem rather than just symptoms. We can integrate water management within the context of other socioeconomic and environmental goals. So we aren't just doing flood mitigation without knowing what the impacts are or what lost opportunities there might be. That allows us to achieve bigger bang for the buck for new build type projects and the longevity of those projects, especially for flood mitigation. And it also allows us to find the best places in the watershed to store water where we can actually use it or hold it for low water periods. So that brings me back to the MWAG recommendations. And IWM has been done in many other places across Ontario, North America, and Europe, and even in third world countries, but it has never been done in Muskoka. It's been endorsed by the Muskoka Lakes Association and the Watershed Council and other groups, as well as the Ministry of Natural Resources and the province itself. And most recently by the District of Muskoka, where a resolution was recently passed to allow the district to enter into discussions and agreements to manage some of the money coming out of the Muskoka Watershed initiative for the first projects. The recent resolution from the district acknowledges the watershed approach, but it also recognizes that immediate work on flood mitigation is needed. And the recommendations include money going into initiating a number of flood mitigation projects, including looking at the operational aspects of the Muskoka River Water Management Plan within the context of the broader watershed management initiative. So it's very focused on the initiation of watershed planning being triggered by the need to look at flooding, but it allows us to look at water management in an entire watershed context. So we know the implications and we know the opportunities better. And I'll leave it there. That list on the screen is the other recommendations that are currently being discussed. There were a total of 19 in the report, but I think I'll hand it back over to Deb now, and we can get into the discussion period.
Great, thank you, Kevin. That's great to great overview of how the system works as well to sort of wrap it all up. But you can stop sharing your screen.
Just trying to get where I can do
then
that here.
we're going to move into question and answers. So I'll just remind the audience that if you have a question that you would like to have asked, please type it into the Q&A box. And if there's already a question there that you like, remember to just give it a thumbs up and it'll we can see which ones are most popular. We do have some questions already and some that were provided in advance of the seminar. So we are ready and willing and able to answer questions. So Kevin, I still see your screen, and then we'll bring back our...
Yeah, I'm having trouble getting off of my screen sharing here. My view has gone wonky. Oh, there it is. Hang on.
Got it. There you go. I think you're off.
Sorry
now.
about that.
Yep. So I'll get Chris Sneer and Kevin Boyle to come back on screen as well. And there we go.
Hoping you can see me now, Deborah.
I got you, and I got you too, Kevin Boyle. Got two Kevins. I was going to have two Chris's and two Kevins. I was going to make it a much more difficult session. So we have a number of questions that have come in. So I'm just going to, I got them all sort of trying to have them organized. But I think the first one we have to ask, and this one's going to you, Chris Neer, is the question that's on the tip of everyone's tongue today is, well, what is going to happen this spring? Do you have a prediction for us?
It's always a relevant question, and it's always a really hard response to give, and it's always a point in time. So I'll caveat it with all those things. I guess I could talk to you about current conditions today, but spoiler alert, I'm not going to be able to tell you if we're going to flood this spring or not. That is outside of my control, and I don't have a crystal ball that will tell me that yet. But just to give people a little bit of information around where we're at in the watershed, lakes right now are currently drawn down largely below target levels for this time of year. I've seen actually within some of the question and answers already coming in that people are noting that either Lake Muskoka or Rosso or Joe are low or lower than they're used to. And that's certainly in anticipation of the freshet. And lakes, I guess, are below the target line within the normal operating zone. But we're in fairly good shape in terms of where we want to be this time of year. We know warm conditions last week and this week we're enjoying or reducing our snow load. Staff were out on the landscape last week doing snow stations, and the snow stations from last week showed we were around average for snow water equivalency. I suspect the stations that were being done today, which I hoping for that information tonight, will show that we're likely below average snow water equivalency. But what we're really looking for is rain in the forecast and how that rain might respond to any rain or any snow that's left on the ground. So I'm gonna temper everyone's expectations by saying right now we're in fairly good shape. We are seeing some rain and warm weather in the forecast. Temperatures next week are cooling off at night, so hopefully that slows things down. But over the next week you will see lake levels rising. You'll see the melting trends continuing. the forecast is where we always run into trouble in terms of accuracy. So anything more than 3 to 5 days is the accuracy really goes down. So that our kind of comfort level with predictions also goes down correspondingly. So any kind of changes to conditions that could result in concerns for residents, we'll obviously be communicating those through our community emergency management councils. We'll be sending out news releases, and we do that in a staged way in terms of a safety outlook. You know, conditions are changing. We may go to flood watch or warning, and so if conditions look like they're progressing that way, we'll share that information. But right now, it's kind of a sit and wait situation. So sorry for that kind of long answer, but
and then we still don't know.
exactly. I'd be buying a lottery ticket if I could tell you right now.
No doubt. Could you just, for the audience, just remind people what snow water equivalency is?
Yeah, so snow water equivalency is when we go out and we measure the snowpack on the ground, and we're looking for a couple of things. We're looking for how much water is left in that snow. We're looking for the condition of the snow, so its ripeness, its ability to absorb rain that might fall. And we're also looking, when we're doing snow samples, at the ground. So is that ground frozen? Is it unfrozen? Is it already saturated? And those are all clues or indicators to tell us, you know, if we see a 15 mil, a 20 mil, a 50 mil rain event in a forecast, how is that going to react to the remaining snow on the ground? And what might that do to lakes and rivers in the watershed?
Thank you. Great. There were a couple of questions of clarification, and I'm going to do those first. And one was the statement that it's not possible to prevent flooding. And I think probably, Chris, I would start with you, and then start with that one first. Is it possible to prevent flooding?
So, and I guess maybe I should have done a better job defining what flooding is, and I would encourage the other panel members to chime in afterwards. And flooding is, I think, generally when, you know, inputs into a portion of the watershed are more than the outputs, and you see levels rise to a less desirable way. So when the inputs into the Muskoka River watershed are more than the outputs out through Georgian Bay, you're going to see lake levels rise and you're going to see flooding. So when we have more inputs coming into Lake Muskoka that then can be discharged, say out of Bala, then that lake level will rise until we reach an equilibrium, or, like, you know, inputs are reduced. So in terms of, you know, why can't we prevent flooding? It's a matter of looking at that cascading system, the constrictions and the dams that are in place. And when we see too much water in the system, and that water can already be in the lake, or it could be coming in the form of precipitation or runoff, contributing to lake levels and pushing those levels up.
Great, thank you.
I would
go ahead,
just,
Kevin. Yep.
I would just add that flooding is a part of the natural process. Flooding is a part of a multi-year annual cycle, and there's ranges of fluctuation in it. And I think in the earlier days of Muskoka, we built a lot of our infrastructure when it was operating in a certain way. But we also know that the natural systems are changing, and so we're going to have to adapt to that.
Good point. So maybe this one for you, Kevin Boyle. How are the actual area municipalities now using the floodplain maps? Are they using them to define where new building can occur, or what mitigation measures may be needed? Can you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, certainly. So each area municipality is using the floodplain maps as a technical guidance tool for applications or develop permits. As you know, that area municipalities have the jurisdiction around building permits, issuing building permits, and interpret the provincial policy statement to determine where the hazardous lines or hazardous lands are, and are they using the district floodplain mapping product as a tool. So each area municipality would have a slightly different approach to using it, but certainly there's been conversations that I've been aware that area municipalities are having some conversations around having more of a consistent approach, but that's sort of ongoing work right now. But certainly they are using it as a technical guidance tool to help inform the planning permit decision processes.
Great. And did anybody else want in that? You're not, nobody else wants in on that one? Okay. So I guess, you know, assuming we've had flooding, and the MLA does put out a little message about when in the fall about getting our properties ready for spring. What advice would you provide the participants in terms of preparing for spring flooding, assuming it was to come? Maybe Kevin Boyle, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So certainly to prepare for spring flooding, I think in a lot of times it starts in the fall before the snow hits the ground. One of the real keys is clearing your shoreline and clearing the property or your property, the things that aren't tied down, right? Even when we have minor flooding, it can take chairs, tables, all sorts of stuff. We've seen lawnmowers and gas cans, not only to prevent sort of ecological damage, but also to secure your property. So anything that's tying down your docks, securing the outside of your property, especially around the shoreline. Another thing is actually leaving your shorelines natural really helps control erosion. It's a great way to help fight erosion when we do have flooding instances. And then, of course, in situations where you have, a boathouse or a structure that's built right on the water and doesn't actually have, the water doesn't have to get that high before it becomes a flood situation. Removing, anything from the main floor of that boathouse, or if you can bring it to a storage area, to a friend's, to a neighbor's higher up on your property, and certainly turning electricity off to those structures in accordance with all local guidelines and the advice of an electrician, of course. But those are some of the things that you can start to do to prepare your property before flooding even happens. And one of the things that you have to remember is sometimes you have to do them in November before the snow falls, because you're going to have frozen everything to the ground, and that can be a challenge, because I've seen that with some friends of mine where I went to help them and everything was just frozen solid to the ground. So that would be a good start. You can find all that in more details on the district's flood preparedness website.
Great. Any other advice, Kevin or Chris?
Sure, I might just add to that a little bit. The province also has a website set up, ontario.ca/flood, and it provides a whole bunch of information on preparing for floods, and it's also a source of information if and when flooding conditions do present themselves. Information is shared in that format. So I would also encourage, in addition to all the great things that Kevin said, just people to be informed and stay informed. So don't be afraid to consult with Environment Canada, the real-time gauges to see what lake levels are doing. Get to know your lake and the plan for your lake and what to expect at different times of year. And that way you're not caught off guard and you're not surprised. So try to get a sense of what's normal and what's not normal. And I know a lot of people are already doing that. I get calls regularly from people saying, this is different than what I'm used to seeing. So I know a lot of people are informed, but I would just say stay engaged, be prepared, and keep up with it.
Good, thank you. So one of the questions that's come up is there a plan to increase the depth of any of the bottlenecks, or to use those as mitigation measures for some of the flooding could occur in the future? And maybe Kevin Trimble, I'm not sure. I think that was one of the recommendations in the MWAG report, but can you tell us a bit more to start?
Yeah, one of the recommendations in the MWAG report, and since discussions have started with the district staff, revolve around making structural changes to the watershed. And the way we're currently looking at it, there are some localized structural changes that we may already know about without having to go and do a bunch of study, and which really need to be done. And I believe that there's discussions around initiating some of those projects. However, the notion that was put forward in the MWAG report was that large scale infrastructure or big structural changes somewhere in the watershed can't really be done. It'd be like putting a blindfold on and throwing a dart at a dartboard and wasting a lot of money, because we just don't know yet exactly what will bring the biggest bang for the buck and where in the watershed, or how big to build it. That's potentially a large scale. It might also be a number of small scale projects too, but a bit more of the watershed hydrologic work needs to be done. And we propose to put together what we call the Water Quantity Task Force, which would be comprised of experts, including both MECP and the Ministry of Natural Resources staff, and the operators and other local experts on hydrology and hydraulics to look at that. So that's where the MWAG report went on that subject.
Chris, do you want in on that at all?
Sure, and I guess in terms of adding to what Kevin said, some of the natural and man-made constrictions are known in the watershed. Some studies have been done, but I would just add to Kevin's kind of thoughtful response in terms of where we could go with some opportunities. I think we need to look at it holistically in terms of any changes and not just throw that dart on the dartboard. We are in this cascading system, so simply looking at one constriction and making a change there, we really have to do careful hydro analysis of what effects could happen upstream and downstream to know if it has the desirable impacts that we want in terms of moving water through the system quicker and not adversely affecting people in the process too. So I think a lot more thought and analysis could be done.
Absolutely. We can't harm one thing to say one, to fix one problem, harm another problem. So on a similar note, there's a question, where'd it go? The pinch point, talking about pinch points, is to whether the new hydro station at Bala actually created a different pinch point than what was there before. Or is it the same elevations in Bala as it was before? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so without having the engineer drawings in front of me right now, I guess my general comment would be the hydro generating station actually added an additional outlet at Bala. So maybe an additional opportunity to pass more flow. I think it hasn't created a pinch point in my opinion, in terms of elevations and digging out. There's an additional outlet there now to pass water through the generating station. What has happened and what will continue to happen is you may start to see the dams in Bala, the north and south dams are still being operated in addition to this new generating station. And they you might see logs in at certain times of year you're not used to, but that could also mean that water is passing through the generating station instead of in that dams. So I would say that the look of how things are being operated there may look differently, but they're still operating in accordance with the water management plan. And I don't see that new generating station as being a pinch point.
All right. I'm just going to a few other questions here. So one of the questions is around the Muskoka River Water Management Plan, and I think you've indicated, Kevin Trimble, that through the MWAG report, there's going to be sort of potentially a marriage of it to blend it into the watershed planning, but it's still got its own management planning process that can't be separated. But today it doesn't include climate change. Nothing does. And obviously we're experiencing that. The number of floods, the work of the Muskoka Watershed Council has said climate change is happening. Here's what we're seeing. And I think it's become an undeniable effect on our lakes. And they predict that it's actually going to be worse in Muskoka than somewhere else because of the change in the winter conditions. So so perhaps could one of you, maybe one or both of you, speak about how we're going to incorporate climate change into these plans so that we are predicting for the future, not just for the past, because the past is not a good predictor of the future anymore. Kevin, you want to start?
Maybe I can speak for watershed planning and Chris can speak for water management planning.
Okay.
And hopefully we're going to see it hopefully in the very near term, we're going to see a convergence of the two. But the bottom line is that if we get all of the data that we can on how the entire watershed is functioning, and then use all of the future predictive modeling that is available to look at what is changing to the extent that we can know that, or how fluctuating that might be, that can be built into watershed hydrology models that can tell us where we might get the biggest benefit from making changes in terms of flood storage. So we will be able to predict a little bit more what kind of increasing flows we might be getting in different seasons, notwithstanding the weather, because as Chris said, the weather is the weather every year. There's only a limited extent to predicting that. and also in the long term for where we could actually build modifications in the system.
Chris, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, that's great. And so I guess in terms of there is an opportunity, there are mechanisms to update the Muskoka River Water Management Plan. It was built and brought in, and it's based on the best available information. If better information comes in that reflects some changes in climate due to climate change that could be built into modeling, I think amendments could be made in the future to the plan. At this time, our ministry is not initiating an amendment to the plan, but we're very interested in the work of MWAG and any other projects that could contribute to our understanding of how the watershed is managed. I guess I'd like to temper that a little bit, though, just in reminding folks that the management plan isn't meant to prevent flooding. So, an analysis, a hydrological analysis, could show us that we're going to see more storms more often, and that might show that a range gets increased. So it might inform residents on a lake that you can actually look forward to more fluctuations. And I just throw that out there as an example. But I would also, we're looking forward to any information and any projects moving forward and how they could inform an amendment if one is considered.
Maybe I could just add one quick thing, Deb, as well. Yep. The MWAG recommendations and the follow-up process kind of recognize that we're reporting to the Minister of Environment, not the Minister of Natural Resources. And so it's natural resources is where the water management plan is run. But as a part of the, and in recognition that flood mitigation was one of the main drivers of us starting to look at watershed management in the first place, one of the things we recommended was that money be dedicated to using the hydrologic modeling project that we've already recommended to look for small scale tweaks within the existing operations of the water management plan to the extent possible, without opening it up for a full gigantic amendment process, which we couldn't recommend. But that would allow, that would be one of a number of things that could get started immediately. And I know that the operators group with Chris are already looking at operational tweaks wherever they can. And Chris Craig of MLA has done quite a bit of his own analytical work, so he's already kind of getting a head start on some of what could be some of the discussions that the water quantity task force could have. But it's looking at what tweaks could we do now while we're laying the groundwork for bigger projects in the near future.
Yeah, I might actually jump in there really quick. I'll try to
go for it.
Being the climate change coordinator, I need to jump in on this question. So one of the things that we tasked our consultant to do was to consider the anticipated increases in precipitation in Muskoka. So to consider climate change impacts when they actually did the floodplain mapping study. And so through the GeoHub, at the top of the GeoHub, you can find a link to that technical report where they actually incorporated some climate change impacts or increases in precipitation into the models. And of course, we did just launch our corporate climate change action plan and our climate action strategy. So there'll be more information coming there, but also, adding the flooded roadways, adding the real-time water levels. Those are all part of our increasing our resiliency and providing tools for our residents to understand what the water levels are doing. And then also to understand if we're in a flood situation, what areas might be more challenging to get through. And we continue to develop those.
That's great. Certainly having the tools to be able to predict where the road's going to flood and to take it ahead of time as opposed to being surprised by it. So, so we've been talking a lot about high water levels, but we're actually getting a fair number of questions about low water levels, and that there's extremely low water levels right now, particularly on Lake Joseph. And why is that? So would somebody like to tackle that?
Yeah, so I guess I can tackle that in terms of Rosso and Joseph are managed essentially together. The outlet being at Port Carling, and the lake levels on Rosso and Joe have been drawn down in anticipation of the freshet, so that flooding, so that filling of those lakes. They are below the target for this time of year, but they're still within the normal operating zone. So we're anticipating lake levels will go up there, but they're low on purpose right now to create some storage capacity for the rain and snow in the forecast.
Well, and we probably met with so many more people staying at the cottage that aren't normally there probably every winter. And maybe people are noticing this more than you might see in past years. So on a similar note, there is a question as well about summer water levels and why we manipulate them during the summer. And I think that it would be good to have a little conversation about the natural drawdown of the lake during the summer, and then whether it is the same as the Muskoka Water Management Plan or whether it is separated from the normal operating zones. Could we start there?
I can just offer a little bit of an introduction, but I'd also welcome any comments from Kevin afterwards. And I guess in terms of the, throughout the summer, if we were largely kind of reliant on precipitation that we're enjoying. So we try to not flood people according to the plan. In the spring, we try to capture what water is in the watershed, at a certain elevation. And then throughout the summer, it's fair to anticipate that lake levels will drop unless they're recharged through precipitation or other events. They're dropping for a couple of reasons. They're dropping naturally through evaporation. They're dropping when we're maintaining minimum flows downstream. So it's that kind of cascading system. One of the things we can't do is create water out of nowhere. I've done lots of water dances outside the office, and they don't seem to bring the rain when I want them, but there will be years where we'll see low water. And unfortunately we can't, if the water isn't there to work with, we won't have it. So we're balancing the evaporation, the minimum flows downstream, making sure no one lake is suffering too much, and doing that all in accordance with kind of the guidelines within the plan. I'm not sure if either of the Kevins have a more articulate kind of natural process part to contribute to that.
Not more articulate, but yeah, no, I just wanted to, I could just add that in a sort of a typical watershed, that snow melt in the early season, water in the system is soaked up. It's held back in all the beaver ponds, all the wetlands, in all the soils throughout the entire watershed, and in not so much in our watershed, but in many watersheds, it also goes into the shallow and deeper groundwater systems. And then that water is available and trickles out into the major rivers and lakes over the course of the season, supplemented by the rainfall. So when you have less of that available at the beginning of the season, it's going to make a difference later on. And as Chris has explained a couple of times tonight, I think that it's a complicated chain of bathtubs over the course of the season. But these lakes do eventually normally draw down to a fall low point usually. And a lot of the wetland shoreline areas, that's what keeps them going, that raising and lowering of the water level seasonally.
That's right. That's
I think
right.
the only thing that I would add, Deb, is that I know we focus a lot on, wet seasons or a lot of precipitation, but we also have dry seasons. And when we have droughts in the spring and summer, and you don't have that water to replace, that's the risk. We're going to have really wet years. We're also going to have really dry years, and they can cause a problem.
Well, I have to say that, we're pretty lucky in Muskoka that we have a managed lake level. I was in my university years, spent a couple of summers on lakes in northern Quebec, and they had no management levels. And so we had to get out and hoist the dock out every couple of weeks. And it was on ropes and barrels, and we had to keep pushing it out to get it floating. So we don't have to do that in Muskoka, which is really nice. So. All right, so there's a complicated question here. I think, again, it's a lake level one, but and I'm going to read it out because it's well stated. So Chris Craig is, as you know, has written a report on water levels, and he notes that the rain forecasts are reliable for only a couple of days, perhaps, and the temperature forecasts for maybe a bit longer, and so that it takes about 8 to 10 days for rain in Algonquin Park to affect water levels in Lake Muskoka. I note that water levels in Lake Muskoka have dropped by as much as 3 inches in a week at various times in the past year. So it suggests to me that a rapid response to weather forecasts could mitigate flooding on Lake Muskoka by as much as 3 to 6 inches. Is this done? And if not, why not? And in addition to dropping water levels more and earlier, can water levels be adjusted rapidly? in response to weather forecasts. So there's two kind of questions. Is it, can we start doing it earlier and greater? And can we do it in response to the to rapid response? So I don't know. Who's ready?
I can
Chris.
share a couple of thoughts. Certainly, I mean, we've noted a couple of times that forecasts aren't reliable, so it is hard. We know we have a cascading system. Yes, things kind of, there's a wave that will go through the system, whether it's high or low water levels, but it's really a challenge to react to a forecast with a rain amount, because that rain amount on the landscape may only show up in Beatrice, or could show up in Raymond, or, you know, so we're kind of, we're mindful of the forecast, we're anticipating it, we're doing some operations, but it's really what's falling on the landscape that we're trying to react to. We're also really challenged by the capacity of the dams, and honestly operating them all at the same time. So the majority of dams are manual, that they have stop logs in them. So those stop logs are taken, you know, removed to increase flow. They're put back in to restrict flow. So to do that across an entire watershed, even when you're removing a stop log, you know, it's changing flow, but it's not doing so aggressively or as quickly as you might want. If you had the ability to really pass water quickly, what could happen is, you know, it could have adverse effects downstream. So if we saw something in the forecast and we opened up a dam, what we don't want to do is flood people downstream unnecessarily. So we're doing these gradual changes across the landscape in reaction to what we're seeing in forecasts, in reaction to what we're seeing on the ground. But we're hampered a little bit by the design of the dams, by how much water they can pass, and by the reliability of the forecasts.
Anybody else want in?
Nope.
Okay. I have one here that I think Kevin Trimble will be for you. How important are wetlands in flood protection or flood prevention?
In addition to their ecological functions, that's a whole other subject, they're extremely important potentially for flood or water management in general in the system. And what we've learned so far about doing full-scale watershed hydrology modeling is we can pull in information on the area covered by wetlands in different corners of the watershed. So, you know, as Chris Neer said at the beginning of his talk, there's areas that have a lot of sand lenses and things like that, where we get groundwater. We have areas with heavy forest cover. There are also areas covered with wetlands, and with the seasonal fluctuations in mind, wetlands basically store an awful lot of water. And one of our potential major infrastructure ideas could revolve around using some of the newer engineering technologies to make wetlands bigger, or make more of them. There's a number of different things we can do, and we would do it in areas where we get the biggest bang for the buck for water management as well as other ecological goals. But I guess the short answer is it's a pretty big role they play.
And Kevin Boyle, were they covered in your floodplain mapping of where they existed in the mapping?
Yeah, certainly. And in those areas of floodplain mapping, I think of sort of towards on the north or the south branch of the Muskoka River, you can see where we have a flood fringe where it just spreads right out. It slows the water down. It acts as a storage for water, and really is important at increasing that lag time between the precipitation event hitting the ground and the water moving through the system. So they're vitally important. So of course, we couldn't map the entire floodplain. We had, you know, about $1 million to do it. So we captured as much as we could, and we based it off, you know, prioritizing the high-risk areas and moving our way down. But in our climate action plan, we commit to continuing to pursue more floodplain mapping projects.
I think you've applied through the National Disaster Mitigation Fund again, I think, or you're going to?
That's correct. We're awaiting a word from the federal government. We were approved, and it was sent on by the province, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, to the federal government, and we just wait for a yay or nay from them, and then we can begin a phase 2.
Well, and it's a couple of questions on terms of why other smaller lakes aren't experiencing the flooding. And I don't think they were covered in your first round. Is that right? Are you covering them in the next round?
Well, with these grants, you have to work within the parameters that the government set, and indeed, the federal government has set a timeline of about 365 days that's supposed to commence on April 1st. So that's very tight, considering we don't have a decision yet, and we still need to get an RFP in place. So in order to maximize the amount of coverage that we would get, we would prioritize areas that we've already flown LiDAR for, because flying LiDAR and doing floodplain mapping in 1 year wouldn't be doable. But also we'll use what the district has, a hazard identification risk assessment, HIRA, and that sort of looks at historic flooding and identifies some higher risk areas. And so we would prioritize the higher risk areas while balancing the LiDAR that we have and looking for new areas to map. So really, if it's a yes, then we'll work very closely with our consultant to see how much we can get.
Good. So there's one here, it's got a lot of votes, so we should get to this one. We're on Lake Muskoka, and it does seem that the lake is currently slightly lower than I've seen it in the past, and that gives me some flood comfort. Going forward, why don't we err on the side of lowering the water a little too much in the spring rather than not enough? This should lessen the likelihood of a flood, it seems to me. If we go too low, we can always adjust levels to normal levels in late May by partially plugging the bathtub in Bala, couldn't we? So there's a lot of people who like that one. Chris, do you want to start that one?
Sure, I can start that one. So a couple of thoughts come to mind, and I'd be happy to have the Kevins jump in afterwards. So I guess, the lake level is currently a bit lower. It's below target. It is to make room in there. What we're doing is following a plan, and there's a target line and a normal operating zone. And the plan is based on balancing a bunch of social, ecological, economic values. So one of the social economic values and environmental values could include something like lake trout spawning. So if we draw a lake down further, exposing spawning beds and the fry that have been laid there, then we might lose an entire year class. Now that may or may not be a concern for everyone, but in addition to that, so that's one of the balancing items. Another one, we receive low water complaints at this time of year all the time around infrastructure, around water intakes, around heat loops. So and also from marinas and other commercial ventures. And so it's kind of balancing some of those social economic things. Lake Muskoka traditionally is easier to fill than other lakes in the watershed, just because it's not a headwater lake. It does have the north and south branches filling it. But so it's not as hard to fill, but I would hate to plug the bathtub in Bala and not provide any water down the Moon or Musquash rivers, because I'm sure we'd hear from people on Go Home Lake, from people on the Moon River. There would be consequences downstream as well, both socially, environmentally, and economically. So I guess, those targets that we set and why we don't draw down are intentional. If more information comes forward to say that, we could mitigate by lowering a little bit and everyone buys into that decision, then we can consider it.
And I'm sure Kevin Trimble would like to talk about the other fish besides lake trout.
Chomping at the bit. Yeah, there are a number of species in the Muskoka Lakes that spawn or hatch in the nearshore areas, and in the early springtime, you'll have walleye or pickerel coming in, and some of those are lake shore, and some of them go up rivers. The lake trout eggs have been sitting on their spawning shoals with specific ranges of water levels and currents that are aerating the eggs all winter long, and those eggs are going to hatch in the early spring period, and the fry only go so far when they first hatch. And then you also have pike and muskie and other species that go pretty early and vary in shore in their spawning areas. And I guess my point is, it's not just fish. If it was an occasional single, we call it year class or cohort of fish hatching, you could say, so what? But the challenge is that they're a part of a fairly complex system, and we're getting increasingly worried over the last bunch of years with not only the climate change effects on temperature and the length of the ice free season, but the trickle down effects of those top predators and what they do to the smaller parts of the food chain that ultimately lead to bacteria and algae that show up as problems for us. So sooner or later, there's a domino effect, and we'll get the brunt of it, I guess, is the point I would make.
We can only manage so far, and I think then the nature takes over the rest. So I have actually let us go on a little too long. I should have cut this off, but that's our last question. You guys are calling on relief, but thank you so much today for taking the time to join us, both our speakers and our participants. At our peak, we had 270 people on the line, and we had 389 registered, who I'm sure will go back and listen to this. So I just want to thank everybody, especially our experts. And I note Chris Craig, who wasn't able to be with us, but Chris Neer, Kevin Boyle, Kevin Trimble, thank you. Your presentations were terrific, and your answers have been really transparent and thorough, and we really appreciate that. I know I learned some new things, and I'm really eager to go noodle around on the district's Geo Hub. I think that's going to be pretty cool, and I'm really nice. It's really nice to see the water levels in one place as opposed to having to go to the gauge and go to somewhere else. So Katie is going to put up a slide with where to find some more information, but there she is, and there. So there's a few resources there that some of which Chris Neer mentioned as well, but so feel free to, this will be posted with the presentations on the website. So I just wanted to say as well, this event has been brought to you by the Muskoka Lakes Association. We are the oldest lake association in Canada, serving our waterfront landowners since 1894. We represent over 2,000 members, family members. Oops, there goes. Our polls are going up here. Sorry, I just got my in the middle of everything. We have 4 areas that we concentrate in. We protect and promote water quality. We advocate for responsible government and fair taxation. We promote responsible land use, and we lead on important Muskoka issues. And I think this is one of those issues. If you're a member, thank you for joining us tonight, and we thank you for being a member, and we urge you to continue to renew your membership, as it really makes it possible for us to do what we do. And if you're not a member, I ask, what's stopping you? So one more thing for you to do is that we've got some polls they're going to put up on the screen. Just tell us how you liked it and if you'd like to see more of those in the future. And as a reminder, we're recording. We will post it on the MLA website for anyone to watch. Just need to give us a couple of days to get it posted, and we will follow up with any questions as best we can after the event as well. So thank you again for attending tonight. Stay 6 feet apart, be good to your neighbors, and good night.